When you want to create highly detailed or organic shapes, sculpting is the way to go. Today I'm going to explain Blender sculpting mode for you. Now first up, there's two different methods of sculpting in Blender. There's multi-resolution and there's dynamic topology. So to do the multi-resolution method, you go to modifiers and add a multi-resolution modifier, and then you go to the sculpting tab. You go back to the modifiers tab, and then you can simply go and hit subdivide. So the multi-resolution modifier is like the subdivision surface modifier, except on each level of subdivision, you can sculpt. So to show this in practice, what I can do is, now that I'm on the first level, so I can go and make big changes, and then I can subdivide higher and make smaller changes. If I were to make a big change on a high level, I can see it on the lower levels, but if I made a smaller detail change, it wouldn't be noticeable. Changes aren't added to the absolute base level since it's just in the modifier. The multi-resolution method is great when you have a well-made base mesh, which is already basically the right shape, and you want to add a lot of high definition details to it. When you aren't basically already at the right shape, it does struggle, however, because you will need to bump up the resolution a lot for the areas where you're making big changes, where other areas are going to have way more resolution than they actually need. One good thing about the multi-resolution is that you can take the high definition sculpt and use the lower level of 1, or if it's very close to the base mesh, even the base mesh, and you can bake details like the normal map onto the lower resolution. Now that I removed the multi-resolution modifier, I'll show you the other method. The other method is called dynamic topology, and it is under Dyn Topo. So I can enable it here, here, or by pressing Ctrl D. Dynamic typology allows details to automatically be added as you go in. This is good for when you don't really have a base mesh, or when you have one that is not fully modeled out. Like maybe you have a stick man rather than a mostly modeled out person that you want to refine the details on. There's a few settings here. There's detail size, which affects the size of your details that you make. So here, if I drew, it would increase the resolution just a little bit. But if I brought it down to 6 pixels in screen size, the resolution gets even higher. There's different refine methods. We got subdivide collapse, collapse edges, and subdivide edges. Subdivide edges can't reduce your topology where you're painting, but it can increase it if where you're painting, say here, is a lower detail size than you have selected. The opposite is with collapse edges, which can only lower the amount in the case where the detail here is higher than what you have selected. And then subdivide collapse, your default does both. Next, there's detailing, which determines what the detail size means. By default, you use relative detail, which works by the amount of pixels shown on the screen where you're painting. What this means is that if you zoom in more, you're gonna get higher definition. So let's say I have set to 12 here. It's okay-ish resolution, but if I get real close, you can see that it's way denser there. Constant detail means that it always goes with the same setting based off of this. Doesn't matter if you zoom in or out or change your brush size. Brush means that it adjusts based off the size of your brush. If your brush is bigger, the resolution is going to be lower. If your brush is smaller, the resolution is going to be higher. And then there's manual detail, which will not add or subtract detail. If you were to choose manual detail, the only way to change the resolution is to go to remesh and do detail flood fill, which will set the entire model's resolution to the resolution you set here. You also have other options under remesh like optimize and symmetrize, which will take, say, the left side and bring it to the right side, which can be set with these, which can go from Z plus to Z minus, Z minus to Z plus, Y, X, etc. The other setting you have under Topo is smooth shading, which simply sets the shading to smooth. Next, I'll go over the other settings, which can be found here or at the top. So first off, we got radius, which changes our brush size. So make it real big or real small. There are other methods to change this, like I could press F and it creates a circle that I can drag out and change the size. I could also press the brackets on my keyboard. The left one goes smaller, the right one goes bigger. Next, we got strength, which determines how strong your sculpt tool is. So if I move it real low, not a big change. Move it real high, much more noticeable change. Strength can also be done with Shift F to modify your strength. Under both radius and strength, we also have a little guy right on the right side here, which does enable your tablet pressure. We also got plus and minus, which if you're under plus, it'll do the default option of your brush. And if you're under minus, it'll do the opposite. You can also do this by not pressing anything other than left click to use plus, and holding your control button while also pressing left click will do minus without having to switch modes. Next up, we got topology rake, which slows down performance a little bit when sculpting, but it will make a small amount of improvement to the topology of your strokes around the edges. Could be helpful, especially on lower resolution models where those slight changes in topology will be noticeable and it won't affect performance too much. We got auto smooth, which will automatically smooth out your sculpting tool a little bit. As you can see, this one goes more out while this one's more smooth. It also has an option to use it with your tablet. So next we'll use the sculpt planes, which will be a little bit easier to see with the flatten brush, I believe. Nice tip is to actually pull this out so you can see your brushes a little easier. So first we got this little lock, which will determine whether it stays in the same plane as when you first made your stroke. So if I tried using my flatten around all of this, you'll see that here it flattens here. If I move it over here, it's going to flatten there. So the plane where the vertices are moving changes as I move it. So if I lock this, it will stay the same. If I move it here, it stays flattening it all in that same spot where I started. Now, area plane does it based off of where your vertices normal is pointed. So which direction is out from that vertice. So the normal on this guy would be pointed that way. So if I were to go there, the flattening will be like that. Now, however, if I went to view plane, it's based off the direction I'm viewing it from. So if I went from there, it'll actually flatten it towards the direction I'm viewing. So if I took my screen, it would match perfectly with that. We also got X, Y, and Z planes, which I'll just show X because they all do the same thing with the different axes. And I went out. It only works on the x-axis, so it'll completely end up, in this case, flattening all the way to x. So the vertices will only move on the x. Next, we got front faces only, which only affects faces that are facing the viewer. So where this is useful is if you got like a really skinny mesh, because the brush is actually a sphere, it will slightly affect the backside of it too. So like here. So if I did front faces only, it'll only affect the front of it and not that back side. So that helps a lot for when you got really skinny things that are causing you problems like that. We got 2D fall off, which changes the brush to 2D rather than 3D. So it's just a circle rather than a sphere. And we got accumulate, which basically, if I were to paint here, it will kind of not go up past a certain amount, really. And I would have to go and add again, and that'll make it go up higher. But if I turn it on, it'll just keep going and keep on going on top of the same single stroke rather than not going on top of the same stroke. Next up, we got our overlay, which quite simply just adds an overlay to our brush to show our curve, which I'll get to later, or our texture. Next, we could add a texture, which will allow us to paint details based off a texture where black will be none and white will be all the way effectiveness. So that can allow us to make very detailed bits, like maybe say the scales of a snake or something. Alright, so I have a quick rough texture that I made. If I went back to sculpting and went to my texture tab, and in my textures slot, I just go and grab that texture real quick. Now I can go and paint with this texture. So I could go and put the overlay on it to see it. One thing is that dynamic topology will turn off automatically when you switch modes. So I can now just sculpt with some of this texture on. So maybe if I went with higher resolution, you see that I can get this rough texture real quick just by painting. With the texture, there's other mapping settings. So rather than just view plane, which is the default, I could go with, say, stencil, and drag this with right click and hold, rotate it with control and hold, and scale it with shift and hold. So I can go and do it like that, or maybe go real small. I also got random, which will just kind of randomly go around the texture. Area plane, which similarly will go based off the normals. Tiled, which will give this big tile thing, and I can paint there. 3D, which will place it in like 3D space, going with the X being here, the Y being there, and Z being up there. So texture doesn't have a Z, so it won't really do anything on the edges, just on the top and the bottom. So I'm going to turn off the texture just by hitting X. Next, we got stroke, which has our stroke method. By default, we got space. Some of these don't really work well, like drag dot. I don't think works that well in this, like it does in texture paint. Line's a good one. You can just draw a straight line. Anchored can kind of work. It just puts a dot in the middle and you can pull out to change the size. We got input samples, which determines how often it checks your input. So if you go real fast, you're going to get kind of angles because it doesn't check where your mouse position is as often. But if I took, say, 50, it's going to be slower, but it's going to be smoother. So it can get a smoother stroke like that. I could also turn on smooth stroke, which is going to give me a little dragging line, and it will pull it around and smooth it by delaying. And it has some settings here. Got curve, which basically the center of your brush is over here, the edge of your brush is here, and then this is up and down is how powerful it is. So towards the center is more powerful and towards the sides is less powerful. So I could do something like click here, bring it down, and I can delete one of these by hitting X. So say I hit here, X, and I can drag this here, and this will make myself a little circle because in the center it's not powerful, in the middle is powerful, and then at the end it's not powerful. And I got some defaults here, like one that you might like is this square one, which will quite simply not have any smoothing at all. Got Dyne topo settings again. We got our options. One option is threaded sculpt, which basically just lets you use multiple cores on your CPU when it sculpts. Fast navigate, which if you have multi-resolution, when you go and navigate like rotating or panning, it will go down to a lower resolution of your multi-resolution temporarily so that it will increase your navigation performance. We got use deform only, which will only use your deform modifiers other than multi-resolution, and it won't display other modifiers. Show mask, which shows your mask if you have one. Then your unify brush settings, which basically says whether we will keep some settings for a brush. Like if we want to keep the strength setting the same, we could enable that. And then if I switch from draw to blob, the settings change. So that will keep the setting the same. We got symmetry lock. So by default, you got on your mirror, you got X, so you can mirror the axis. You could turn that off and make unsymmetric details, or turn on any of these. We got lock, so I could lock the X and Y axis and it won't sculpt on any of the other axes. We got tiling, which will tile our stuff, which doesn't really display well here. But if I, for example, had a plane, I could make a tileable model with that. Now I'll quickly go through each of these brushes. So the first 7, the blue ones are all very similar. They basically all draw. So draws on top. Play, also draw on top. It's lighter. Each of these have situations where they're a little bit better, and a lot of other situations where it might just be more preference. We got clay strips, which is a little bit more of a flat one. We got layer, which builds on top. Looks like it's one of the ones that don't really work with dynamic topology. We got inflate, which will just inflate. We got blob, which will make a blob. We got crease, which makes little indents. And of course, with any of these, I could hold control and it'll do the opposite. So that will pull it out. You can see it pulled it out instead. And as you can see, if I went to draw and went with control, maybe went with a smaller brush, I could get similar results. So all these brushes can be quite similar, but crease is good for like getting little cracks and stuff. Next up, we got our smooth brush, which just smooths stuff out. Now, I don't really switch to the smooth brush often. Instead, I can hold the shift key while using any other brush and it'll automatically change into the smooth brush. So, and I can just smooth it all out, just holding shift. Next, we got our flatten, which as I showed before, flattens stuff out. Changing the settings on the plane is quite useful for flatten. We got our fill, which if I had a hole, I'll just kind of fill it out. We got scrape, which will just kind of take parts off the top. We got pinch, which will pull things inwards. So I can pinch and make these inwards. Or I can maybe say, make this a much tighter crack. And if I hold control, it pulls it outwards instead. We got grab, which can grab things and move them around. This doesn't add topology though. We got snake hook, which is like that, but you can move and you can curve, and it also that works with dynamic topology and adds more to it. Oftentimes you end up with little guys floating though. You go too far and it gets too thin. We got thumb, which just kind of pulls a little. It looks like that. We got nudge, which just kind of nudges things over the side. We got rotate, which will rotate things. So that can be useful for maybe if you're sculpting like a railing or I don't know, maybe like a curl on your hair. Next, we got mask, which is really useful. I can just go and draw a mask here and it'll be black. And what I can do is I could go to draw and I can draw here, but it won't paint where the mask is. Or if the mask isn't fully blacked out, it will sculpt in the middle. Simplify will basically just go and reduce the polys with your dynamic topology. If I raise this resolution, it would get lower. This doesn't work with multi-resolution. We got box hide, which if I drew a box here, it'll hide everything. And if I hold control and do it, it'll show everything. We got box mask, so if I drew a box, it'll mask it out, and if I hold control and draw a box, it'll unmask it out. Next, I will go ahead and go to layout, delete this monkey head, add a cube. I'm gonna hit control 3 maybe, apply this, and I'm gonna go to sculpting, and I'm gonna sculpt a rock. I'm gonna turn on dynamic topology. I'm gonna go to my symmetry lock, make sure that it's turned off so that it's not symmetrical, and I will go ahead and maybe grab the grab brush and start out farther, and I'm gonna go and start to try to make a bit of a shape here. That's kind of interesting, hopefully. There we go. Now I'm gonna go with the flatten brush. I'm going to go ahead and turn on the lock on the area plane so that it doesn't curve when I flatten stuff out. And I'm just going to start flattening stuff out. I'm going to turn the strength up higher. Now we got kind of a rocky shape. I'm going to get smaller. Next, I'm going to go and turn down the strength a bit. And I'm just going to add just a little bit of a markup around the edges. Try to add a little extra detail. I turn the detail size up. And now that I have all the edges marked out, I'm going to just use shift to smooth it out a bit. So now we got those edges roughed up a little bit. So I'm going to go and grab a texture, and I will use a stencil, and I'm just going to kind of add a little bit of roughness detail in. Now we kind of got a rock, so I'm gonna end this video now. If you like this video, like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Thank you.